Good morning and welcome to this stakeholder webinar. I am Vibeke and I represent Control Risk Management and MQM AS, and we're going to talk about stakeholder management today. I am currently in Spain, in my home office in Spain, and last week we had visitors staying, and that was quite practice in stakeholder management. I'm not going to get into that, but you know, we have it in our private life and we have it professionally. But one of the visitors had a very interesting case from his workplace regarding stakeholder management. He works at a high school in Norway, and they were in the middle of reorganizing their IT systems for communicating with students and parents and teachers and administering information and sharing information. So they were going to change from a very old-fashioned style to newer applications and newer systems. And his analysis was that he had three large stakeholders, or stakeholder groups really, to consider. The first was, of course, the students. The second was the teachers and the school administration as one group. And then there was the parents of the students under age 18, because they are require the information as well. So you have kind of three user groups that you're going to try to activate towards using this new system and to sell into and to actually adjust the system to be as good as possible for them. So that was his stakeholder management challenge for the upcoming school year. My visitor hadn't made any formal stakeholder analysis or anything, but you know, he knows his workplace. He's been there for many years, and he realized, even without doing a stakeholder analysis, that there are many groups to consider and to try to satisfy and to try to activate. So it's we have them all on all levels. And the reason I'm holding a webinar on this is really that there's a lot of risk in relation to stakeholder management and how we navigate and manage our day-to-day business and our strategies. My goal for this webinar is that you will leave with some valuable insights, or at least some reminders that you can use in your risk management and your day-to-day tasks. If we have any participants willing, we will have a discussion in the end, or I will answer questions if there are any. So just hang on for that. I will touch upon how stakeholder management and understanding of context are highly connected. I will also talk about how stakeholder management is an important part of managing and navigating risk. And then I will present some easy techniques to assess stakeholders and plan communication strategies. And of course, I will give you some conclusions to go. Okay, then I'll start my presentation. Let's see, share screen. And then share presentation. Okay, so let's go straight to context and stakeholders, the connection between context and stakeholders. The concept of context is really about mapping and understanding the environment your organization is functioning in and trying to create value in. It's about both understanding the internal environment and the internal relations that impact to which degree your objectives are achieved. But it's also about understanding the external factors that form the way you need to work to be in business. In a way, you could say that producing oil comprises of a number of processes, such as extracting the oil and gas from the ground or seabed, processing it, refining it, and bringing it to market in a state that's useful for the customers. But as many of you know, there is a lot more to it. Operating in the North Sea will be different from operating in the Middle East or running a fracking operation in North America. And yeah, to mention some contextual differences, you have the weather conditions, social involvement, you have the environmental profile of the different countries, you have rules and regulations that will be different, you have different degrees of worker involvement. At least in Norway, you know, the worker has a lot to say in the totality, and all these factors impact how you would run your operation and how you need to, what you need to focus on in addition to the actual production and logistic processes. Let's see. Yeah. The stakeholders on the other side are people, groups, or formal organizations that are affected by your activities, who may be affected, who has an interest or perceives themselves to be affected by your activities, even though your organization view them as not being affected. And stakeholders are may very well be found both internally and externally to your organization, just as you have an internal and an external context. So the concept of context is about mapping and understanding the environment that your organization is functioning in, and the stakeholder perspective is about identifying the individual forces within your context that will, that may, that could or should use their power or influence to affect your results, or the people or groups that have a natural stake in how you go about your business. Stakeholders are also providers of information. That's not part of the classical definition that you see on the right side here on the presentation, but I think it's good to include that point as well. Any person, any group, any organization who sits on or provides information that could be useful in your work to achieve your goals and to evaluate risk, or that are affected by your decision-making, that have information that could affect your decision-making, should be included in your list of stakeholders. You might want to groom them a little bit to make sure you get what you need. So if we continue with the oil and gas example, also the list of stakeholders would be slightly different from the North Sea to the Middle East or the fracking operation in North America. In all examples, there will be worker groups, of course. There will probably be some labor unions, and you have also the informal leaders with a stake. All these have a stake in the activities and the decisions that are made. There will be a regulating and controlling authority, neighbors, environmentally conscious interest groups, shareholders, customers, contractors, media, professional experts. You have a lot of groups and individuals that could be a stakeholder. But how a labor union, how strong a labor union is, will be different from the different areas in the oil and gas example. How strong the hierarchy is will be different in the different cultures you operate in. So this is the assessment of each stakeholder. That's where you find the differences. My suggestion is then that the stakeholder perspective and the context perspective needs to be seen in connection to each other. You cannot, doing one will help doing the other. So you can first map the context, and then from the context you will get a list of stakeholders. When you have the list of stakeholders, you might even have included some more than those who represent the context that you've been able to describe. And then you can go back and improve your context description. And then you have a sort of an iterative process that keeps being more useful and specific. So if we see risk from a stakeholder management point of view, it's very important to have a look at stakeholders, because many of the stakeholders have power over our operations. They have power of our possibility to reach our goals and our possibility to go about with our activities. So you have kind of a risk that comes from the relation, you have a risk that comes from the quality in the information that you have, and you have a risk connected to compliance, regulating authorities and such. So that's why stakeholder management is important, both in risk management and in also quality management. In ISO 31000, the definition of risk is that risk is the effect of uncertainty on objectives. When I communicate, I usually use some additional words to increase the probability of my audience understanding what risk is. I usually say something like, we manage risk to understand more of what stops us from achieving our objectives and to understand more of what supports us in achieving our objectives. The first being the negative risk, the threats and unwanted scenarios. The second being the positive risks, the opportunities and wins. So we manage risk to understand which actions to take to increase the possibility of reaching our objectives. I just wanted to have a quick look also at the risk management model from ISO 31000 2018 version, where there are a lot of places in the model that we can see that stakeholder management is essential in risk management. This is my own drawing of the model, a little bit more color. But it's the same content. So within the principles, I would say that at least the principle of integration, inclusion, best available information, and the emphasis on human and cultural factors reflect the need to match stakeholders. Within the framework, one could argue that the whole framework will require stakeholder management, but at least the parts concerning integration, design and implementation must take stakeholders into account. And as you probably would agree with me, the framework should be established to support leaders and employees to take risk management into use. And it should be developed with an eye on the needs and interests of those internal stakeholders, the users, and in connection, of course, to the organization's objectives and goals. And there you have sort of the connection to the external stakeholders. On a risk management process level, the circle to the right, risks are identified and assessed in more detail, and stakeholder management comes very strongly in the point. You see me tilting my head because of the direction of the text. Yeah, because this point about communication and consultation, constant communication and consultation with experts, with stakeholders, with regulating authorities, anyone having information about the area of risk that we are investigating. Yeah, there's a lot of stakeholder management in this point. So to transform this to the purpose of this webinar, I would say that stakeholders are sources of information because they bring other views and knowledge about situations, activities, and risk to the table. They may be supporters or opponents to an organization's activity, and by that making them sources of risk, positive or negative. For example, in Norway, we had recently a case where one person managed to slow down an entire governmental administration by sending numerous requests for documents and these documents, they shall be made publicly available whenever requested from the public. So he had the right to request them. But his main goal was to request as many as possible to kind of force the system to its knees. And his political objective was really to point out that the system of transparency, which this solution really is trying to achieve, transparency with regards to public communication and public decisions and dialogue between public parties. The system is outdated. That was his objective, to show that it is outdated and that the documents should be far more available to the individual than they are in reality. And finally, the effect of his actions were that this system for sharing documents, it's an electronic request, but it's a manual process to actually get the documents to the person that is interested in them. Yeah, it was severely slowed down and it was actually on the verge of collapsing. And of course, such activity from one individual stakeholder is very hard to predict. But the example shows how one individual stakeholder can make a lot of noise and actually impair the functions that an organization is trying to maintain. So it's a risk to their delivery of service. Lastly, stakeholders may be your supporters in improving or handling risk. So any communication or forming alliances with stakeholders may, it may vary, of course, but it may also be a tool to mitigate risk. So an example would be involving workers in design and implementation of safety routines on a site or a factory. When you involve them, you form, first of all, alliances, but you also give them empower them to actually work safer. So by having a good communication with these stakeholders, you get a safer workplace. So there are some easy techniques to start using stakeholder management or start working more structured with stakeholder management right now. These techniques will give you a quick oversight over your context and then your stakeholders. And I'll just show you how we usually do it and what I find to be useful and not that time consuming. Context, covering or understanding, describing your context is could be a very time-consuming job because there's a lot of areas, and when you go deep into it, it's kind of never-ending. But the Pestel analysis is a good way to start breaking it down and understanding it. It covers the basics, and you can always include new areas to the acronym Pestel. But Pestel stands for the political context, the economical context, social context, technological context, environmental context, and of course the legal context. So the political would be, let's say, there's a difference in running a business in communist China, or I don't know how communist it actually is, and capitalist USA. The economic context is also important. You know, whatever happens in the economy of the world will play a role. Difference between different currencies will play a role, the volatility and in all this. But also such a simple example as why are all the haute couture shops, the high-priced fashion shops placed in the same street in the big capitals of Europe. They aren't placed on a bus station. They are placed in the same street, so they are in competition with each other in a way, but still they are also benefiting from this mindset that anyone entering that street will get into. They know they get into this street where everything is fashion, everything is expensive, and they benefit from their competition, really, because the customer has a mindset that's more positive. Social context, yeah, well, you know, one culture will be different to operate in than another. The social support system in one country can be different to another, and this will impact how people, or how you can operate. Technological as well. There's a reason why the Norwegian power-intense industry was so successful at one point. The power was cheap, and the nearer they were to waterfalls, the better conditions they had. They had a lot of access to workforce as well, because people living very far out in the districts could suddenly get a job. So they had access to a lot. The technological part being power and being able to run them, but also, you know, socially and environmentally, I guess. Legally, there are all, yeah, environmental. I skipped that one. You wouldn't place a business that requires a lot of use of water in the middle of a desert. And you wouldn't start, or you wouldn't be allowed to either, to start an activity that releases a lot of pollution in a protected environment. legally, laws and regulations are different in different areas of the world, and they will impact how you can operate. So all these factors can be found both internally and externally in an organization. And by looking at them, setting up some keywords on each of these topics will give you quite a good understanding of where you are and what you need to do to operate good, to achieve your goals. So the process of the stakeholder analysis. I think this is a model that is widely used when organizations actually take the effort to analyze their stakeholders. And there's a lot of other information one can put into this model, but this is the simplified version of it. It's not very time consuming. And it's you can do it as a standalone analysis, but I think it will be better if you start with a context analysis and then, such as Pastel that I talked about, and then do this technique afterwards. So basically, it's about finding out who your stakeholders are. It could be individuals, groups, organizations. Determining which business areas, your business areas, will be affected if they are activated, and also why and how. How could the areas be affected? It's about determining if the stakeholder, each individual stakeholder, has a positive or negative attitude towards your activity. If you run an oil company, you can be sure that Greenpeace has a basically negative attitude towards your activities. If you run an oil company in Norway, you can be sure that the tax authorities will be quite positive to you, because they have they get a lot of money. They earn a lot of money to the state from your activities. Also, the kind of power and influence the stakeholder has over your possibility to achieve your goals and perform your activities should be analyzed. So, do they have significant power over your activities or insignificant, high or low? Typically, a regulating authority has significant power and influence, while individuals have less power. But as I talked about in the example before, an individual can be quite powerful as well if he has money, time, a lot of will to point out his right or his point. The next step is to determine the level of interest. So even though a stakeholder can have much power and influence, it's not sure that he has an interest in your activity. So it could be like the sleeping bear. A stakeholder could be like a sleeping bear. You don't want to wake it because then he will give you trouble, or he will use his power. But if you tread lightly around him, you or her or them, you can go about your business more easily. And based on these steps in the blue model here, you can choose, determine what kind of strategy you should choose. In this example here, it's the amber box that's chosen because we have a positive attitude. That doesn't matter, but we have a stakeholder that has insignificant power and influence, but he has a high interest. So you want to keep him updated make sure he doesn't give you a lot of trouble, but yeah, he can't really affect you that much. And then you have yeah, just the people, the stakeholders that don't have any influence or any interest. They could be the blue box, pay attention. The stakeholders that have a lot of influence but not a lot of interest, like the sleeping bear, is the green box, and of course the red box or pink box. You should closely follow up because they have both the power and the interest in how you conduct your activities. I just wanted to include a screenshot of how it can look in reality. Now, this is in Norwegian, and this is from a system that we made. I'm not going to say much about it, but as you can see, you can't understand much probably, but as you can see on the right side of the schematics, there is a choice of communication strategy here. And this example is just from a hotel trying to determine its stakeholders. As a minimum, the output from a stakeholder analysis would be to choose a communication strategy like these boxes that I showed you. If you have a more complex stakeholder, if you have a more complex situation, developing a communication plan could be a good idea. A communication plan will give you a more controlled process towards each selected stakeholder, and it depends. It's a matter of cost and benefit, really. But when you have a communication plan, it's more easy to build a relation, and when you have a good relation or an open relation, an existing relation with your stakeholder, you usually get a better result. Normally involving people in your organization and in your thinking and why you go about doing certain decisions, it will lead them to supporting you even though you don't make the decision that benefit them the most or that meet their wishes or needs. So an open communication strategy will normally support your ability to achieve objectives, at least where I come from. My background is European and Norwegian, so openness and transparency is very important in these areas, at least. So some conclusions to go. There's always something to say in the end. There's a lot to be said about stakeholder management, and I have touched upon how stakeholder management and context understanding is tightly connected, how stakeholder management is an important part of managing and understanding and navigating risk. And I have shown some easy techniques to assess stakeholders and start to plan your communication strategies. And to conclude, being oriented about the environment you operate in and the interest that exists inside and outside your organization may lead to better control, more information, which again will help you operate your business even better. One could say, I would say, that assessing stakeholders is really a risk assessment. It's assessing risk from a limited point of view, from a scope that's only focused on stakeholders. And also communicating with and consulting stakeholders, having a dialogue with them about your decision processes that you have internally may give you a lot of leeway when it comes to what your stakeholders will accept from you and your activities. So hearing stakeholders out and hearing their opinions normally softens their attitude towards you. So that's the benefit. However, I want to finish up with one invitation to action and one open question to give you something to reflect upon. So the action would be to do a quick analysis of where you are a stakeholder yourself or your organization. And by doing that, you might see something new. You might learn something about your own stakeholders. You put yourself in the shoes of others, and then you see the world from a different viewpoint. And my question that I would like you to at least reflect upon, I've made some discoveries on this point myself, is should you always show considerations for your stakeholders' needs and points of views? Is it always the best to please your stakeholders? Is that the right approach? Or could it be that you actually should be aware of their attitude, aware of where they are, but not necessarily meet them on their views? You could end up in a situation, that's what I did, where you kind of sacrifice your own strategies to please your stakeholders. And nothing good comes from that. You need to hold on to your strategies and your objectives, even though you want to have a good relation with your stakeholders. And sometimes you probably have to choose. So that's my food for thought. So thank you very much for attending this very short webinar, and I'm very sorry for the delay and the new connection details that not many people got. This whole webinar will be recorded, and I will send it out at least during tomorrow, together with this presentation. And of course, if you need something, you can always contact me by email. No hesitation there. I love to have a good discussion. The next webinar will be on activating risk owners, and it will take place on Monday already, 16th of July. And I hope you will join me then as well. So we'll see if we have some questions. It's possible to write questions in the chat box, or we can have a panel discussion. There are not many people on here, so we'll see. If you have anything, let me know. Are there any questions? No. Then I will just finish up with, I have one more slide actually, that I'll just show you, because it's yeah, well, it's something that I usually try to talk about, but I didn't have time this day. But now, if there are no questions, or if nobody wants to discuss anything, I'll just go through that as well, and you'll get something extra. Let's see. So share screen. I showed you one technique for evaluating context and one technique for evaluating stakeholders. But when I do my trainings and hold my courses, usually I get the question: so which techniques should we use at what time? In what situation should we use this, and what situation should we use that? And there is no easy answer on that. no matter, if you want to do a stakeholder analysis, if you want to map your context, you need to choose your technique based on the needs you have. So it's an individual choice, really. There's no right or wrong answer here. You have to look at the information you have available, the information you think you will be able to produce, the earlier assessments you have made, the analysis you already have, and how you kind of quantify your in your analysis, and the level of detail you need. And based on that, there are some decisions you need to make that should also play in. And of course, you want some results in the end. And you have to look at where you want to end up when you choose your technique. If it's choosing a technique for assessing risk, or if it's choosing a technique for assessing only stakeholders. So that's my the point I wanted to make as an extra today. Okay, then I'll just say thank you for attending, and if you didn't see all of this, you can go back to the replay when it's ready tomorrow. Okay, thank you, and keep having a good day. Bye-bye.